Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. We are live this evening for what promises to be a most interesting conversation among some individuals of libertarian persuasions, some individuals of socialist persuasions, and at least one person who is both a libertarian and a socialist. So with that in mind, I look forward to a constructive exchange of ideas. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I consider myself a strong libertarian and a transhumanist. I also have studied Austrian economics at Hillsdale College and have written several papers on the subject of Austrian economics. I consider myself an advocate of free markets, individual liberty, and technological progress.
That was quite an intro. I am Wendy Stolyarov. I also consider myself a libertarian transhumanist. To differentiate myself from Gennady, I would say I am friendly toward alternative economic systems in a post-scarcity society. I don't think we're quite there yet, so for the time being, I think libertarianism is probably the best way to move toward that future as a stage, shall we say. I also studied economics, including Austrian economics, at Hillsdale College. So that's me.
Awesome. All right. So my name is B.J. Murphy. I am a socialist of a Marxist variety. I came from it as an activist for several years, from being a member of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, doing work with the CPUSA, and then getting involved with the transhumanist community as a sort of stepping stone to allow for capitalism to reach its, I suppose, peak of efficiency to the point of where it becomes irrelevant in a post-scarcity society. So that's where I am on this front, and yeah. And Brandon?
I'm Brandon King. I actually really greatly agree with Wendy. I'm a libertarian at my core. I've been a socialist for a couple years now. I believe that we should accept capitalism as that's what we are at, but we should be ready to move on to a socialist post-scarcity society when that comes about. Sooner the better.
I would say that, to distinguish myself from that a little bit, I don't think we currently have a capitalist society at all. I think that it's a crony kind of capitalism. Thing.
We have another participant who has just joined us, Jules Hamilton. We're glad to have finally gotten him on our hangout.
Wow.
Welcome, Jules. We are just starting with introductions.
Hey, Jules.
So, Jules, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Can you hear us, Jules?
I can hear everyone very well. Sorry about that. My internet just was acting like a ghost. I'm Jules. Hey everyone. I'm a model. I'm a filmmaker, aspiring philosopher. I have a blog, and I'm very interested in the future of our world. So here I am.
From an economic perspective, where would you say you're coming from?
That's a good question. Well, I love chaos theory, so that's my foundation in how I think complex systems work. I think Milton Friedman has been the best explanation for the economy that I have encountered yet. I also really like Nassim Nicholas Taleb's explanation of complex systems, specifically anti-fragility, and that's kind of a brief overview of where I stand economically.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Jules. I think we already have a lot of interesting ideas to talk about. First of all, I am myself an admirer of Milton Friedman. I have read Free to Choose, and I found a lot to sympathize with there. And also his earlier work, Capitalism and Freedom. I have mixed feelings about Taleb myself. I liked his first two books, The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness. With regard to Anti-Fragile, I am let's say have a different outlook on that work. I wrote an extensive critique of it. My primary critique was Anti-Fragile seems rather collectivist in its outlook to me. Instead of advising individuals how they could be anti-fragile and how they could improve their individual resilience against calamities, disasters, market crashes, etc., Anti-Fragile seems to look at collectives as being fragile or anti-fragile, and even seems to advocate the individual sacrificing himself on behalf of the collective. So that is my commentary on those two works. But another idea that I would be interested in everyone's comments on is how socialists can embrace essentially capitalism coming to its logical conclusion or the logical instantiation of its premises. And is there a possibility for alignment in terms of specific policies that are advocated? If socialists like BJ and Brandon think capitalism needs to logically develop itself, is there a room there for liberalization of the market, for increased individual liberty to get us to the stage of economic development where BJ and Brandon would think socialism would be appropriate?
BJ, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't accelerationism typically considered in the Marxist realm of socialism?
Yeah, I would agree that accelerationism it's sort of being intertwined with the Marxist philosophy insofar as that, I'll speak on my behalf as a Marxist, that it aligned well with what Karl Marx had originally talked about, where he looked at socioeconomic systems as something they operate within staged developments. You can't simply try and violently overthrow an economic system. Okay, we are a socialist society now, and that's that. He deemed it as absurd, and that it would only be disastrous as a result, because whenever you take on a new system, you have to, I suppose, take on its conditions of which it is planted as then. You cannot simply ignore those conditions, or it's going to become a disastrous route as a result. Instead, you have to allow that system to mature. You have to allow it to grow on its own, or at least adhere to the market forces that that system adheres to. And with that, that's why, as a Marxist myself, I'm not necessarily anti-capitalism. I'm merely against people within the system who are trying to ensure that it remains in stasis. I want it to grow. I want more people included and to benefit from the system, up to the point where we can reach a future where capitalism isn't overthrown violently or anything like that. It just merely becomes irrelevant. That it's a new socioeconomic system that capitalism can no longer accommodate. Yeah.
I really loved what both of you are saying. I think you both brought up a lot of interesting things. I didn't realize, just to backtrack, I didn't realize those things or notice them as much as you did in Anti-Fragile. I guess I read it. I'm sort of a unique case. I'm a polyamorist, and it comes from partly from my perspective of longevity and living longer lifespans, and I believe people are genetically non-monogamous, and it's a side issue. But Anti-Fragile, I think, talked about how smaller systems thrive in with socialist dynamics, but the larger the system becomes, the more unstable it becomes, right? So while I think Anti-Fragile may have been seen as sympathetic to socialism, but when I read it, I wasn't thinking about small countries or even large companies assisted by artificial intelligence. I was more looking at the principles of anti-fragility in complex systems as could be applied to small family units and then large institutions and systems. But I totally appreciate those criticisms and notes on Nassim Taleb's book. Also, he was anti Ray Kurzweil.
Mm-hmm.
He's he's totally. So he's yeah, exactly. So he is totally not like my end all be all. However, I think a lot of what he says is very valuable for thinking about these things. So I think that it's his book was lacking maybe advice on how to be what were you saying, like an individual, like, or someone
Yes.
that can like have some. I don't think that's what his book was about either, though. You know what I mean? So like it was a book that's like I thought like a good modern perspective on how complex systems work, but it didn't like give a lot of answers to other questions. So again, a flawed book.
Yeah, well, I think Taleb himself is a little bit of a narcissist, and that's reflected in Anti-Fragile.
Yes,
Actually, it's also reflected in his tacit support for Donald Trump. He said that Donald Trump is the first anti-fragile presidential candidate.
well,
And-
that might be true, but that's not necessarily any reason for admiration or praise.
Exactly. It's
right?
not
I think-
necessarily a
I
good
think-
thing to be anti-fragile if it means abandoning civilization.
Yeah,
Sometimes
well,
things
and
need
also,
to be protected.
but it's a good lesson on how to not to raise snakes to bite you either, right? As in, just because someone is anti-fragile, you know, you don't want to grow a hydra, you know, like with the way you fight anti-fragile systems either. So
Mhm.
again, it's an interesting book. Nassim, he kind of drives me crazy. He's one of those guys that I love to hate. You know what I mean? Like his Twitter feed is constantly saying like the craziest shit, and like he says
I
so
think
much
he's
stuff that I roll my eyes. He says so much stuff that makes me roll my eyes. But not with all of that notwithstanding, like I loved Anti-Fragile, and I do love the Black Swans, and like I think
Sure.
he's provided for me at least like very approachable like references like that have been easy for me to communicate to others when talking about these things. So
There's
I think
no doubt.
he is
Yeah.
I think he is a valuable contributor to where this discussion could go, even though he's a total narcissist, deafist, like fucking, you know, all sorts of flaws, you know. But we can toss him aside. We don't need to talk about Nassim Nicholas Taleb anymore.
I'll say this, I
That's
suppose, in closing, because I think it's relevant to the broader thread of the conversation. Nassim Taleb is in many ways a reactionary against the 18th century Enlightenment
Yes.
ideals of rationality, individualism, and increased complexity. In a sense, Taleb advocates systems that are resilient and, in his words, anti-fragile by virtue of, in effect, being quite primitive. So, yes, human beings have subsisted for the vast majority of human history as small hunter-gatherer tribes that perpetually warred against one another, had like a 50% death rate in tribal skirmishes, but humankind survived until the agricultural revolution, and through essentially happy accidents of history, undertook at first a gradual path and then an accelerating path of technological progress. And especially since the 18th century Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, now the Information Revolution, we've had a dramatic departure from prior tribal systems, collectivist systems that were in their way stable, if you could call them that, but also in a Hobbesian sense were characterized by life being nasty, brutish, and short. And the Enlightenment moved us away from that. Transhumanism can move us even farther away from that, but in a sense we have to embrace a very new type of thinking, a new dynamic of civilization that embraces complexity, that embraces continual evolution, and at the same time where individuals now have an intense moral significance and individuals are valued, and the realm of each individual is respected through property rights, through the rule of law, through institutions that, let's say, don't tolerate the kind of chaos where there's tribal warfare or the Hobbesian war of all against all.
I love it. I love listening to this. This is great. This is definitely what I live for. So Hobbes is a very interesting case. There are critics of Hobbes that he might not have, like when it comes to life, always be like shorter for sure. but it might not have been as grueling as many people imagined before agriculture. You know, Chris Ryan, specifically the author of Sex at Dawn, spoke about how he believed human societies in the hunter-gatherer world would operate and, you know, help each other with certain burdens. But that notwithstanding,
The noble savage.
but well, here's the thing, right? Like when you're talking about like I think etymology becomes important when we start throwing certain words like that around, right? Because ultimately, a savage is someone, I believe, that I would say is callous and maybe decreases the well-being of others around him or her, or like someone that's like what, brutal, murderous, you know, like savage. Like to be a savage is someone that's very uncivilized. Right?
I'm using it in reference to previous usage.
Well, Rousseau
yeah.
is really the antithesis of the Hobbesian view in that case, because he was saying originally primitive peoples were generous, kind-hearted, open in a certain way that civilized men are not, and civilization ruined it all. Hobbes was saying quite the opposite. The uncivilized state is a war against of all against all. Primitive people are brutish. Civilization is needed to.
Well, it's not. The reason I
And-
don't think it's all against all necessarily. Well, it's so. I'm trying to wrap. I guess I'm trying to also wrap my head around everything you said, because I agree we don't want an all against all.
I don't think anyone here is a
situation.
Hobbesian.
Right.
Right.
I don't. Right. We don't. And I think that, you know, I believe that it's in our DNA to want to be good and help others. Like, we want to thrive and survive, and one of the best ways to do that is for others around you to thrive and survive.
Sure,
you know?
I think
like, I believe
trade is a net positive, or people wouldn't engage in it.
Yes. So that's where John Locke comes in, actually, because John Locke, he wrote before Rousseau, after Hobbes, but he represents, let's say, a more tempered view of the matter. He also wrote about the state of nature, and the state of nature is filled with conflicts and it's filled with problems, because even if people are sometimes good or capable of goodness, and they have certain rights, certain prerogatives to look after their self-interest, their judgment tends to be biased in their own favor, for instance. Or if they're completely in the right, they may not be able to enforce that judgment, their wishes of what is just. So the Hobbesian Leviathan is a government that is set up essentially to impose order and civilization on a chaotic world. The Lockean government is more of a government that is derived from the consent of the governed. People get together and say, well, it's more efficient for all of us to form an institution that helps ensure what our best self-interest would be, which is to protect us from aggression by our fellow men. At the same time, it's important to institute restraints on that government to ensure the only prerogatives it derives are those that have been legitimately delegated to it by the governed. And that is the origin of a constitutional system, a republican system, which in the United States has been attempted very imperfectly, and with loopholes that enabled that system to degenerate into something a lot more tyrannical.
Well, yeah, so I think that's a really good bridge to the conversation, and I love talking about classics and old thinkers, and ultimately the reason why I love talking about them is because they provide very good explanations for things, but also I believe it's really important to try to strive to improve explanations for things, and we can also try to simplify the conversation and maybe make it more express by, you know, accepting that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and we can reference where some of our ideas come from when it's relevant. But ultimately, we're talking about the difference between a top-down, you know, like federally regulated system, or a system like a Wikipedia or something where there is regulation, but it's not regulation imposed like from the top down. It's self-regulation by people who are passionate and invested in the system, like literally, right? People like Wikipedia is the world's greatest like encyclopedia, like I believe, for a reason. And I think the fact that you can't just go on Wikipedia and like do whatever the hell you want and vandalize pages, and like you will be stopped, like your vandalism will be corrected, you know, and the system continues to thrive and grow. And I'm a big fan of Gavin Newsom. Well, I wouldn't say I'm a big fan of him, but Gavin Newsom wrote a very interesting book, Citizenville, which was endorsed by Cory Booker and Al Gore. And basically he talks about how government can't do anything. All of their institutions are failing. Like, they're all bankrupt. They don't work. Government sucks. And we should just outsource as much as possible to, like, private individuals. And I was like, why aren't people talking about this goddamn book, right? Because it's basically, like, the whole, like, in my mind, like, I traditionally saw, like, the Democratic and Republican Party as separate, and now it's just like I feel like we have two populists running. You know, Hillary and Trump, they're both crony capitalists in my mind. Basically, they're all for, you know, a highly regulated capitalism that just makes it easy for people on the top to exploit the system by lobbying in their favor and getting laws passed in their favor, and it's just like crushes the middle class and keeps poverty where it is. And I believe, you know, we're in this tug of war between socialism, right, on a federal. When I talk about socialism right now, like, I'm talking about federally regulated socialism, right? I'm talking about federally regulated socialism. I think that would be a serious problem. However, I think there are sentiments in socialism, in the notions of equality, in notions of basically making sure that we don't have an Irish potato famine, you know? Like, if you have an Irish potato famine, you shouldn't just let everyone starve and say survival of the fittest, you know? Like, but also I believe that, you know, when you look at the New Deal, I think it discouraged a lot of potential philanthropists and people who are in places who traditionally did help others, right? They said, why would I create these institutions when the government is already pouring billions of dollars into it already, right? Like, if the government wasn't supplying all of these pretty shitty benefits that benefit a very small number of people, and then we blast that and market that and make it seem like all these institutions are doing well when they're not, and we discourage private individuals and private solutions from, like, coming up with better alternatives.
Yes,
especially
they get crowded out.
So it's I'm very interested in how AI is going to change the game, and how there's going to be dramatic job loss. And, you know, I've recently become very open-minded, something that I wasn't open-minded to at all. I've become very open-minded to, you know, universal basic income.
Yes.
Is something that I've really started opening my mind to, and it's sort of like, instead of having like a socialism versus libertarianism, or like individual versus collectivism, I've been trying to think about it like a yin-yang. Like, there's values of incorporating, like, Eastern and Western worldviews, you know, valuing the individual and the collective. And I think that's really going to be one of the best mindsets for harmony in the future.
Well, from my
I think it would be a good leeway. Oh, that's okay. Go ahead, Wendy.
No, I've been talking a lot more than you, BJ.
I was just going to say, I think that would be a good leeway, you know, talking about the classics and, you know, the integration of those both ideas, and, you know, especially what you said, Jules, about being on the shoulders of giants. I think Brandon would provide a good insight on that, because I know, Brandon, you come from a libertarian socialist point of view, and you mentioned your interest in people like Peter Kropotkin, because of his beliefs in a sort of integration of communist theory, but with the integration of decentralized government. So I think you would provide a good insight on that as well.
I'm actually coming to socialism from where Jules is at right now, actually. I was originally, as I said, you know, libertarian like him, and his transhumanism and the emerging technology, universal basic income, automation, all this stuff that made me start thinking about, you know, socialism in a more, I guess, positive light. I've always been a fan of anarchism, though, so I got into socialism through Bakuninism and Kropotkin and Proudhon.
What do you think? Do you advocate Kropotkin's idea that a decentralized method of governance would lead us to I suppose, to a future that we all are aiming for, or should there be some kind of centralization in there?
See, that's the thing. When it comes down to it, how I see the future is we need to establish the infrastructure to ensure self-sufficiency, for every individual. The only real centralization that I see as necessary is like the asteroid mining and then the transportation of those resources to the people. Other than that, decentralized and localized is what I see as the best way to go.
If everything is decentralized and localized, then you essentially have a minarchist government, which is libertarian at its core.
Yes, it's interesting because I do see some similarities in what all of us have been saying. And in fact, the original visions of socialism involved the government at some stage at least withering away.
Yes,
and individuals essentially would coexist peacefully without, in the socialist views, the constraints of private property or economic power relationships. But I think it could happen in a different way, in the sense that people could become so prosperous as individuals, and they would still have private property, but it would be easy to get additional resources for living or for pursuing whatever endeavors individuals may be interested in. Even today, there is a bit of a movement toward that. If you want to create art, if you want to create music or consume them, or consume any of an array of available entertainments, that is virtually free right now, which has not been the case in any other era of human history. If 3D printing in people's homes becomes widespread, or if it becomes widespread in medicine, you would start getting very cheap access to small-scale material goods or
healthcare. Well, the materials for the 3D printers are going to have to get cheaper as well. I mean, we're not yet to the stage of Star Trek replicators where they can just pull subatomic particles out of the air and build stuff out of them. So there's still scarcity with regard to those in a way that there isn't with regard to digital goods.
Right, but there could be a movement toward that, and at the point at which, for instance, in the United States, food is still subject to material scarcity, very much so, but there are very few people who are starving, and nobody in the United States needs to starve. Even the poorest of the poor could afford much more than their daily required caloric intake. Now, contrast that to what Adam Smith was writing about in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, when he was comparing the diet of the English laborer to the diet of the French laborer, and he was saying, well, how much better the diet of the English laborer is, because the English laborer can always afford some nice fresh white bread every day. And I imagined when I was reading that these English laborers were just eating nothing but this white bread, and maybe it was fresh, maybe it was good bread, but ultimately a diet of bread alone isn't going to get you to even the optimal life expectancy without technological augmentation. So we've come very far when the poorest of the poor in the United States can enjoy a much more varied diet and can live a lot longer than the average wealthy individuals would have expected to live in the 18th century.
And which I think is just as important, if they have any acute medical need. Now, I will say there's a huge problem with the existing medical system in the United States.
I think it's artificially expensive, though.
Yes,
like, I feel like
that's a different direction.
Because of the FDA, because we need tort reform, and because there's like all sorts of reasons.
I
like,
think we can all agree that the medical system is broken.
Get more money. It's like, I feel like, especially when you start having robots replace doctors, which I think is coming, like, health prices need to come down, and we need to not make them more expensive with good-intentioned regulation. We try to make it available to everyone, so we regulate it, and then we totally fuck up the healthcare system, make it more expensive, no one can afford it, and then we're like, we need to give people money to afford it, and it's like totally backwards. It just doesn't make sense.
Yes, I agree with you. But the point that I was attempting to make was that in, say, the 1700s, if something acute happened to you, if you got your foot caught in a lawnmower or something, well, they didn't have lawnmowers. If somebody stabbed you in the leg with a bayonet, you were probably going to lose the leg. Whereas now we can save people from acute crises and treat chronic conditions better too. So, I mean, obviously medicine has come a long way, but the system is definitely still broken.
Well, the three... Yes. Go ahead.
I feel like the discussion also, because like I feel like we all come together because we're all transhumanists, and so we're future-minded, and we're thinking about, you know, what direction are things going in, and how can we order it? And I do believe that maybe even the socialist versus libertarian framework is misleading, right? Because like for me, all I care about is that a free market is allowed to exist so that people that want to participate in it can. Also, I don't want people to be starving or like, you know, destitute and like without hope for upward social mobility, right? So like if you give, let's say you have artificial intelligence, you know, helping out, like working in finance and working in law, and you know, and you have automation manufacturing things, and you have driverless cars doing the transportation. If there's some way to replace current institutions that just hemorrhage money and redistribute it with a basic universal basic income, and allow prices to, you know, allow the market to find an equilibrium in where the prices are, so people who only get the universal basic income obviously are not going to be able to enjoy in everything. One thing that I'm kind of against and worried about, and this is a philosophical thing because we're nowhere near this, is this idea of a future with perfect equality. And when I say perfect equality, it's like every single person has all the same stuff. And there's two reasons why that
equality is not about everybody having the same thing, it's about everybody having the same access.
Exactly. Well, I think that is an important part of the discussion because I don't think everyone sees it that way. I think, for example, there's like when I hear people talk about the Star Trek economy, like all I say is, I'm like, guys, there's a hierarchy on the ship, right? It's not like every single person on that ship gets the point in the direction the ship is going. So like any sort of scenario where like there's like true abundance, that there will still be scarcity. Do you know what I mean? Like
scarcity of time, if nothing else.
Right.
Not just that, but also each individual ideally would still have a realm of private property. Like, let's say hypothetically we were transported into a future of superabundance where most goods are either cheap or free. I would still like to keep this office and everything is just the way it is. And I might add to it. I might procure other property.
I have no interest in your trophies. I'm sorry, Gennady.
Well, but that's the thing. Everybody would be able to have divergent interests, and everybody's space would be unique. I would like a hyper-pluralistic society, which is even more diverse than what we already have. And I think that what Jules is getting at is the fear of a Harrison Bergeron kind of society, where those who are particularly unusual or talented are pressed down or limited to the level of others in order to create equality. I think that's something that a lot of libertarians fear about socialism. And I think it's a strong man, probably.
I think a lot of that comes from I think a lot of that comes from an unfortunate history where, you know, the idea of socialism, it's not that old, and there have been a lot of idealists throughout history who are always concocting new ways of trying to integrate the idea at its core into various different structures of society. Like there are plenty of socialists in history who are trying to redefine or trying to challenge the notions of family, trying to challenge the notions of private property, and these were all ideals, and they've sort of been integrated into a single ideal today. But people tend to have a misconception of what it means to be a Marxist or a socialist or a libertarian socialist at that. But for me, I think it goes down to its core that everyone is taken care of, or at least have their basic necessities taken care of. Because it wasn't during a time period where a person having access to the basic necessities were extremely difficult for so many different people. And so today we're in a very unique time period, as Gennady pointed out. You know, we have access to things that we've never dreamed of before. And I'll give credit where credit's due, and a lot of that is because of capitalism. And so where we go from there, I'm actually interested in what people's thoughts are on, if anyone's heard of him, of Jeremy Rifkin, the economics theorist, on his ideas of a zero marginal cost society.
Yes, that would be ideal.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
And
I had to read this guy. I'm writing this guy's name down. Here we go.
Jeremy Rifkin. I watched an interview with Jeremy Rifkin that was fairly extensive. It was done by Nikola Danilov, a.k.a. Socrates, of Singularity One-on-One. And that was where my impressions of him came from. But yes, he seems to be left-leaning in many of his economic views, but he, in my view as a libertarian, mitigates that in a way by noting the potential for technological progress to cut down the costs of production and, in a sense, usher in a future of technologically driven abundance. So in that sense, I agree with him, and I think there is a lot of common ground to explore there.
Right.
Now, speaking of common ground, I think it would be a good idea to start establishing some points of common ground that we can have in spite of, or maybe even because of, our self-identification as either libertarians or socialists or both. So first,
death is tyranny.
Do we agree that death is wrong? The
Yes.
death of innocent humans who haven't harmed anyone or initiated aggression, at the very least, is wrong. See, no disagreement?
You see, I oppose all forms of oppression. That includes the oppressions of nature, and death is one of them. If it is not voluntary, the only way that you should die is if you choose, an irrational state of mind, to die.
Exactly.
And I still think people should discourage you from doing it.
Yes.
You know, I agree with that. I definitely don't think you should be killing people who especially haven't, like, initiated any violence, like, you know, towards you. It's one thing if, like, someone jumps in your house with a gun trying to kill your daughter.
Right.
I mean, it's like, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I support self-defense, you know? I mean, if somebody's trying to kill you,
then that's oppression, and you're going to fight it.
To preserve your own life.
But I would never want to, like, kill people in a revolution, or, like, you know, like all that kind of stuff. It's just, like, not.
But so-called natural death is wrong. So plank number 1, death is wrong.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That is bad.
That's good.
Is there like a second plank to where we're all do not like Donald Trump? Just
what?
So let's continue exploring other planks. So, for instance, we've talked about universal basic income, and suppose there were a proposal to replace all existing welfare programs, which are contingent, they're need-based, with some exceptions like Social Security, which is a function of how long you've worked and what your income was and how much you've paid in payroll tax and whether you're subject to alternative pension systems. But setting all that aside, replace all of this, Social Security, Medicare, welfare, etc., with a single unconditional basic income that every individual receives in an equal amount, solely for being alive, whether they're Bill Gates or whether they are the most impoverished homeless person on the street. They get the same amount each year, and it's up to them what they do with it, how they spend it, whether
I don't mean to cut you off. Are you? I feel like I understood your. Is there more caveats?
Well,
we can fight about the caveats.
We can discuss the caveats. For instance, how would it be funded? I don't know. Hypothetically, it's possible.
I lean towards your side. However, like, I'm open to talking about the universal basic income. I think it needs to be. I think you need to replace institutions that currently exist, and I think that you might scale it in certain ways over the course of time as artificial intelligence and abundance develop more and more, right? So like maybe you have a sliding scale, right? Like just like maybe you have like people at the bottom get like a slightly larger basic income than like people at like the top, but I feel like everyone should be entitled.
We can argue about the details later.
Yeah, like I'm open to these things. I lean on your side, as in it should just be flat and everyone gets the same. However, I would not argue myself blue in the face as long as you get rid of the sort of disintegrating and hemorrhaging institutions that we have, and just like redistribute that money in the most effective way possible, which is what I think a universal basic income would accomplish.
The idea, I think, is to have the universal basic income ease us into an automated society, a society where we are post-employment, effectively.
Yes.
So right now, people define themselves by their jobs. They feel trapped by their jobs. There's a lot of wage slavery, if you want to call it that, because jobs are so sticky. It's very hard to leave one and find another without enduring hardship.
There's this talk about, the automation and artificial intelligence and how it's making an impact on the job force, and that's where I tend to sort of distance myself from the idealist sections of the Marxist community, because they do not see how they're more emphasized on labor rights in terms of their right to collectively bargain, which I'm in favor of, but I think there's a limit to it, because eventually there's going to be the big impact where people don't have jobs anymore because of advanced automation and machinery. And there's a funny little quote. It used to be misattributed to Lenin and them. No one really knows where it came from, but I like the quote insofar where it says, "A capitalist will sell us the rope with which we will hang them." And to me, when I thought of that, I was like, oh, well, that kind of sounds like 3D printing and all of this artificial intelligence, that it's putting us to a point where the capitalism is allowing these technologies to emerge, but these technologies are also going to create a brand new paradigm shift economically, socially, where we no longer need those who originally brought these technologies forth.
Well, they would develop without capitalism, right? Like if you had no capitalist societies, like I do believe that, the tyrants of whatever their respective governments and economies were would develp this stuff. And
I don't know if they would be able to.
I think one of the biggest,
this is where Ayn Rand, I think, is instructive.
Maybe not,
because he essentially says you cannot coerce a mind to perform the work of the mind. You can coerce a body to perform physical labor, just like tyrants throughout history have coerced legions of manual laborers to build huge monuments.
But then how does North Korea have nukes? Do you know what I mean? Like, they get there eventually.
The technology already existed. Nobody had to invent it.
They kind of reverse engineered it from much more advanced systems that exist everywhere.
And diagram.
The Soviet
China also helped as well.
Yes. Yeah. The Soviet Union was an interesting case as well. It was a kind of intermediate case in the sense that, although explicitly its leaders proclaimed the ideals of Marxism and socialism, there was, first of all, a large underground private economy that was tolerated in some eras to a greater extent than others.
It's like Animal Farm. It's like Animal Farm.
Exactly, yeah.
Some are more equal than others.
When it was suppressed, that was the most difficult period during Soviet history, the Stalin era. But prior to that, there was Lenin's new economic policy, which essentially tolerated capitalist institutions for a few years. And after that, with Khrushchev, and especially with Gorbachev, there was significant economic liberalization, and all throughout that there were some experiments, for instance, with currency or with decentralized production that kept that society in a fairly miserable state, but in a state that was still not a third world type of condition, whereas a more thoroughly autocratic and totalitarian system like that of Kim Jong Il and then Kim Jong-un or Mao in China led to much more devastating consequences, widespread starvation, because not only can a tyrant not bring forth massive technological progress, a central planner can't even manage to figure out the basic needs of the population. This was the great breakthrough of the Austrian economist, particularly Ludwig von Mises, when he wrote Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. He was talking about the ability of a single central planner to collect all of the information needed to make decisions for essentially millions of economic actors as to what is in their best interests, even what basic goods do they demand and what proportions. No supercomputer could even tabulate all of that information and rationally allocate those resources.
Depending on the size of the supercomputer, but I still think it would be a massive waste of time and energy. That said, speaking of supercomputers like that, has anyone else read the Culture series by Ian M. Banks?
No.
Yeah, fantastic. Cannot recommend it enough. It's
what's it called?
The
I've been
Culture.
meaning to read it. Heard a lot of good things about it, read up a little bit of it, but haven't actually read it yet.
It's really, really good. It's kind of it's a post-scarcity, anarcho-socialist. I wouldn't quite say utopia because humans are still humans and people still have problems. People will always be people, no matter what economic system you put them in. But it's really excellent. So recommend that. In any case,
the name? What was it again?
Ian M. Banks is the author. IAIN M. Banks, B-A-N-K-S. And it really is.
Elon Musk was just recently sort of talking about that with the idea of a neural lace that came from the cultures. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So death has been not quite eliminated. Most people choose to live about 400 years, and then death is voluntary at that point. There are some people who choose to live much longer than that.
What? What?
Yeah, I think that's kind of I think that comes with it. You know, the idea that death isn't necessarily eliminated completely to the point where people can no longer choose death.
Right. It's
as a
just
transhumanist and as a person who believes in democracy, individual's choice, and that death should be, a choice. And as a friend of mine from the biohacker movement once told me, I suppose the future goal in a transhumanist society is that death becomes a choice, that suicide is the future death, essentially.
I agree.
Suicide.
That and, of course, horrible accidents.
Support the right to suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the mortality rate should decrease asymptotically towards zero.
Significantly.
Yes, but it may not ever reach zero because there would be causes of death that humans wouldn't be able to anticipate, or if humans push out their boundaries, they might encounter other risks, say a spaceship accident or a similar type of event. Now, I wanted to...
Can I finish my point on the culture? The reason I brought up the culture is because the society is run by giant minds, which are massive, huge artificial intelligences. And each, effectively, planet or ring or ship or whatever has its own mind that manages everything. So, but because it's post-scarcity and it basically generates stuff out of subatomic particles, and you don't have to have a machine managing moving goods from point A to point B. How much do we need of what, where? All of that disappears when you can generate goods out of the ether.
Yeah, we still need to get there. We still need to get
we're not there
right?
yet.
Yes. So I wanted to note, in terms of solutions, proposed solutions like the universal basic income or any sort of society where decentralized individuals and institutions make decisions, that's a fundamentally different type of solution from a central plan where someone from the top down decides who gets what and tries to coordinate everything. And it seems that a lot of the popular cultural conception of socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat model, where the government takes over everything and tries to run everything. That's not necessarily what even socialist ideology would state. If anything,
Bakunin actually, he's the father of anarchy, stateless socialism. The way that he envisioned it, it's not necessarily no government or no rules. It's just no rulers. What Bakunin envisioned was like a bottom-up confederation of workers, basically taking over what the government does instead of top-down as we currently have it.
Well, he advocated revolutionary violence against heads of state. I will say this. As part of my opposition to involuntary human death, I am opposed to violent revolution. I am opposed to the infliction of aggression on human beings.
That's where I feel transhumanism comes into place. Like, I believe that the Soviet Union could have succeeded if they had the technology we have today. I believe that socialism it came about way too early. It was an idea way ahead of its time.
Well, do you mean like a centralized plan could do it with the right technology?
I don't think so.
Because I feel like it's important to partition the sentiments of equality and like being brothers and sisters with our fellow man and like everyone wanting to be equal, and also like not creating a system of like scarcity or like a caste system that's impassable, right? And I think like basically what an institutionalized socialist system does is, first of all, like all the people in the government are more equal than the people that aren't in the government, and you have like this very closed system where social mobility is impossible. So like if you're part of the masses, like you'll be, I guess, like relatively equal, but if you're not in the system running it and exploiting it, like you're not really in a good situation at all. And I think that's
not how it was supposed to go, and that's why I believe that the success is intrinsically tied.
Of course, that's not how it's supposed to go.
Advancement.
But that's how it inevitably will go.
Yes, and I think the issue is human beings, biologically, are still fundamentally the same as our Paleolithic and Neolithic ancestors were, and there is still this tribal dynamic at play where so many people want to be the chieftains of the tribe, and they want to get all the resources, and they want to club their potential rivals to death and get all the women. And the whole role of civilization, the whole role, it is Donald Trump, essentially, but the whole role of civilization is to redirect those impulses and to suppress their dangerous aspects. But civilization, through economic incentives, through external technology, can only do so much. What I think is important for the future is augmentation of the human being, him or herself, so that these tribal impulses essentially no longer play a dominant role in the psyche of most human beings. Now, some humans are better than others in avoiding those tribal impulses, and with different incentives.
By the way, Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Yes, excellent book. I've read it myself. He talks about why violence has declined throughout human history. Well, in fits and starts with some reversals, but right now we're living on the whole in the least violent epoch in human history. And incentives do matter as economists. Like, so if you have a society, a set of institutions, a set of physical constraints or enabling mechanisms that allow more thoughtful, gentler, more foresighted people to have the upper hand, then that leads to a better world. Whereas if you have the tribal chieftain types or the contemporary Donald Trump types having the upper hand, yes, the bigots, the ethnocentrists, the populists, the nationalists, those are the types of people who want to return us to this antagonistic tribal type of collectivism.
You keep saying tribal. You keep saying tribal, and I don't associate it with tribalism at all. But I might just be missing something or hearing it
differently. Tribe in the sense of having one group that you divide and separate from another.
My team versus your team.
Yes,
yeah, us
exactly.
Versus them.
Exactly, and it's a relatively small group historically. The typical Paleolithic tribe was, say, 100 to 150 people, and the problem with a lot of ideologies that have emerged since then is they have tried to transpose that model onto larger human societies. At the very least, in a Paleolithic tribe, everyone knows everyone else.
There was still murder.
There was still murder, but
rape.
At the very least, people could somehow anticipate the behavior of individuals, and if you happen to have a compassionate chieftain, he could serve the needs of particular people within the tribe. You cannot scale up that model. You cannot have a society where everyone knows everyone else, no matter how good your communication is, just because you're limited by time. Even if we could telepathically communicate with one another at a distance, at most, how many people could we do that with? Maybe 10,000 for each individual. So a society of millions and billions of people cannot work that way. There need to be impersonal, still decentralized ways of pursuing what we want, in essence. And this is where a system fundamentally of individualism and individual rights is essential. Because
I think what Brandon was saying, I sort of agree to a certain extent where, Lenin, he sort of understood this to a certain extent because, as you mentioned, he brought forth the idea of a new economic policy where capitalism can continue to flourish because it was, to him, it was a system that was still in its infancy. It needed to continue growing, and that the markets had to continue growing. And of course, Stalin then stepped in and said, no, we're just going to plant down the ideas of socialism, and we're going to bring it forth right here, right now. And these were ideals that were destructive, and it did not allow the markets to operate as it was supposed to. That's why, as a Marxist, I always like the ideas of Deng Xiaoping, where I don't necessarily agree with his role in the Tiananmen Square protest, but I loved his ideas about capitalism allowing to grow. But to me, for his ideas was economically capitalist, politically socialist, and that was in the idea that we allowed capitalism to grow, but politically in our minds we were trying to ensure that everyone was benefiting from this system, and that was where the idea politically socialist came from, that we allowed capitalism to grow, but we allowed it to grow to where it was beneficial to everyone, as opposed to the ideas of crony capitalism with what we are seeing today here in the United States.
I find that such a strange division because socialism and capitalism theoretically should be pure economic systems. They shouldn't have anything to do with other types of moral principles, for example, apart from the moral principle of the individual.
I don't think you can, and I think that I don't think you can separate them. I think that sorry, go ahead.
I wasn't done making my point. The idea of that kind of individual rights is just as present in, for example, a kind of libertarian capitalism. The idea of egalitarianism was essential to the very first Libertarian Party plank, for example.
So equality before the law.
Yes.
Irrelevance of circumstantial characteristics like race or ethnicity
That's not
or
unique
gender.
to socialism in any way. So I find it very strange to call that culturally or socially socialist.
So,
well, the thing is, libertarianism, when it started, was socialist. It actually opposed capitalism way back in the 1830s, 1840s.
I'm talking about 1974.
1971, Libertarian Party founding.
Yeah.
so they were opposed to say segregation, Jim Crow laws from the beginning.
Their very first presidential candidate was openly gay, and he was the first openly gay presidential candidate ever. And they advocated for gay rights way before any other party. It was only very recently that gay rights became a thing. So.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's an interesting bit of common ground that we can pin down here. Opposition to crony capitalism. And by crony capitalism, I define the use of government structures by incumbent business interests who are politically connected in an effort to secure existing economic advantage. So let's say Donald Trump is an example of that. Donald Trump has extensively used eminent domain to raise private people's houses to build his casinos, or say taxi cab industries, traditional taxi cab industries who have resisted the entrance of Uber and Lyft and other ride-sharing companies into their jurisdictions are another example of crony capitalism. Or say the big three automakers in the United States.
Blocking Tesla.
Well, I don't think they're blocking Tesla. Now the dealerships are trying to block Tesla because Tesla doesn't use a franchise model.
Yes.
But say Ford didn't take any bailouts to its credit, but GM and Chrysler essentially survived because of federal bailouts.
I think we can all agree that once a company gets too big to fail and the individual is a microscopic part of its business model, to the point where any given individual is irrelevant. And you can see this in the big banks, you can see it in the large car makers. At that point, too big to fail means, I think, too big to care. Too big to respond to appropriate market incentives.
Well, I wanted just to make, I just want to bring it back before responding to your point, Wendy, because I think it is important to pinpoint common ground. I agree that I'm against, crony capitalism as you defined it, exploiting institutions to provide benefits to special interests over others. I think that's the problem. You don't want a big government, so that you don't provide those exploitations or room for exploitation. So very against crony capitalism. And I think it'd be interesting to talk about how to prevent crony capitalism. But I am interested in other people's thoughts. And Wendy, I would love to talk about what you brought up afterwards as well.
Yes. So, Brandon, would you agree with...
Yeah, let Brandon, because I was going to ask what Brandon's thoughts were on this.
Would you agree? Yeah. Would you agree with my opposition to crony capitalism as I've described the practice of crony capitalism?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. Especially the whole too big to care is, too big to fail is too big to care point.
Yes. Excellent. BJ, what about you?
I would note, I agree that crony capitalism, that is, it's a form of capitalism that, it in its idea is that capitalism as it is currently established is great as it is. It can no longer grow because there are certain special interests up top who are benefiting from it, and it's backed by greed. And that they do not want other people to acquire what they want. It goes back to what Marx had said in his written.
Well, that's where the term crony capitalism is.
I would disagree insofar as the idea that it's not intrinsically capitalist, but it has remnant of capitalism in the ideas of where these special interest groups fit out of their. At the expense of other people, and that might not be what was intrinsically capitalism, which I would agree. But it would, as I said, Marx himself said in a contribution to the critique of political economy, where he said, and I quote, "No social order is ever destroyed before all of the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have mutual framework." And that is the idea that capitalism must be allowed to grow. It must be allowed to mature and bring more people into its system where they can start benefiting from it. And that's where I come from on my Marxist position, that I'm not against capitalism as it is intrinsically, but I am against people who are trying to thwart it, trying to put it in a state of stasis where it can no longer grow. I think it should grow and continue benefiting everyone else.
So
yeah,
I think it's
big
good.
Big oil not allowing the development of solar or electric cars to maintain the monopoly over the fuel.
Yes.
For example.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about with this too big to fail. So thank you for bringing that up, because basically I believe monopolies are apocryphal. Like, I believe the only type of monopoly that can grow and be impossible to compete with is one that's been subsidized and backed by government, and then been like institutionalized by laws that like defend its place, right? Like if the government doesn't subsidize an industry and like give certain people a leg up over others and like help something grow, like you'll never have a too big to fail situation. It'll fail on its own or continue to thrive. But as long as you don't have like the government like artificially like juicing something up, you're not gonna have these like these monstrosities, like these monstrous monopolies that everyone fears. Like I think that people kind of get a little freaked out by the potential of monopolies and don't really understand how like a dangerous monopoly really develops.
Yes, I agree with you, Jules. Essentially, I think it's important to establish the distinction between crony capitalism on the one hand, which we all seem to oppose, and then free market capitalism on the other hand, which is a system of free competition, open access, and then profits and losses. And both of those components are essential. You need profits to encourage people to develop particular innovations, be they new technologies or consumer goods or models of services, but then you also need the potential for losses as essentially that means of when there are scarce resources, signaling business owners that this may not be the most productive allocation of those resources. If, for instance, you believe that writing illuminated manuscripts is the best possible business model, well, you're going to have to charge commensurate price for that. You may find some enthusiasts who will buy your illuminated manuscripts for you, but if you want to compete with, say, mainstream book publishers or publishers of online articles who will essentially post the same content for free, and you expect your illuminated manuscript business to displace them, and you expect to earn a living by, say, charging $10 per illuminated manuscript, you're not going to...
Sounds like it could work, though. I don't know. I feel like that could be a thriving business. I have no idea.
Actually, when I was 6, I tried to write by hand a phone book. Don't ask me for more context than that, but the 6-year-old me thought it would be a viable business model. The problem was that I could only make one copy, and to make a second copy other than a demonstration to even sell to anybody would have been prohibitive of my time. And so obviously that idea didn't go anywhere. And it was then living in Belarus that I found out about computers and what they could do. So
let alone a printing press.
Yes. So obviously profits and losses help business owners realize what are productive uses to put one's time and effort and capital toward, and what are counterproductive uses. So writing phone books by hand, not a good business model. And if you tried to launch a business with that, you'd run out of capital very soon, and you'd go out of business. So that mechanism, I think, needs to exist as long as there's scarcity. Now, if there isn't scarcity, if people just have their basic material needs met and they have all the time in the world, I would say as long as they survive on to the next day, there's no problem with them writing phone books by hand, if that's what they enjoy doing.
Right.
Right, whatever.
But I think this distinction, going back to the distinction between free market capitalism and crony capitalism, so socialists, sometimes at least, think that capitalism needs to develop to its logical conclusion, which could be a new economic paradigm, at least as those socialists would posit it. So here's another possible point for common ground. Allowing free market capitalism, the good kind of capitalism that harnesses competition, private property, innovation, on a level playing field in a sense. So no subsidies, no special favors, just businesses trying to develop products to please consumers, and there might be some laws to protect against fraud or protect against protect against essentially the types of harms that consumers purchasing a product wouldn't be able to discern on their own, like does this piece of bread have arsenic in it for whatever reason.
Well, what I really like about the internet and social media is that it's providing a very good, it's kind of providing an eternal judge for people to codify each other's behavior. So if there is a business operating on its own, doing a lot of things you don't like even today with modern technology, it's a lot easier for that information to get out there, and it's a lot easier for people to respond, whether they approve or disapprove of how you're dealing with your waste or how you're treating animals or whatever it is that your business is doing. I guess I brought that up because I'm sorry. What was it that you were just? I was going to connect this to something and I just lost my train of thought. What was the common ground that you were just talking about?
The common ground is support for free market capitalism today, if only as a transitional step towards something else. So I'll grant that caveat. But free market capitalism, where people are free to compete and there are no entrenched established economic interests to try to freeze the economic system.
I know what I was going to say. I know what I was talking about. I have mixed feelings about I've mixed feelings about intellectual property law as it is and patent law as it is today.
Intellectual property and patent law are awful as they presently.
Because I believe in the importance of private property, and the part of what I'm struggling with imagining is when property becomes more and more intangible.
Ideas aren't property. They can't be.
Right, and so now in this new economy, when you're automating everything, and it's going to be people designing things for you to print on your 3D printer, you're not going to get your son a Lego set. You're going to give them the program to print the Lego set. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so
I'm an illustrator, and I do digital painting mostly. What I have experienced is a shift from a goods-based economy to a service-based economy. So instead of charging for the painting itself, which, I mean, obviously I do deliver the file as necessary, what I charge for is the act of painting a particular thing, not copies of the thing. Do you see?
The service, not the product, right?
Yeah, exactly. The service, not the product. So say you're a musician. Somebody could pay you to compose something. They don't pay you for a copy of the song after.
That makes sense to me. Not right now, I don't think, our current model, but as far as
with art, with digital painting, that's the only way you can function.
I think the market will have to bring us there, though, right? I don't know what to do about patent law or intellectual property law. It's not something that I've really looked into as much as some of these other things yet, but I do have these creeping suspicions that they're outdated and flawed.
Yeah,
I'm fully against it.
I think that goes right back to what Jeremy Rifkin was talking about. As you said, Jules, you haven't heard of him yet. I would recommend reading his work.
Absolutely.
Jeremy Rifkin was talking about how we are slowly getting into a point where we're sort of, in some aspects like art and music, we're seeing a partial zero marginal cost, but we're integrating ourselves to where, what happens when it does reach where it is zero marginal cost, and the ideas of currency and income and being paid for your labor, what happens with those type of concepts once we actually reach a point where everything is at a zero marginal cost?
Yes. Now, I think it's good to try to, let's say, articulate in the status quo what are favorable developments that we would perceive from our point of view. So, for instance, we have addressed some of those. I would consider replacing all existing welfare systems with a single, flat, unconditional, universal basic income to be favorable.
I like that idea.
I would consider eliminating all subsidies to businesses to be favorable. All subsidies,
including subsidies to coal,
right.
to sugar, to corn.
I agree with that.
To a variety of entrenched interests which are preventing, well, effectively creating barriers to entry for
exactly what it does. That's exactly what it
companies.
does. It makes it harder for the small farmers. It makes it harder for, it makes it harder for the little guy. When you start subsidizing an industry, it's the people that are getting those subsidies that are able to artificially grow to these, like, monsters.
And then you have to support them if they fail, and then it just...
Because we're dependent on them now, right? It's ridiculous.
And I would also support eliminating coercive, let's say, economic redistribution from individuals to business interests, say in the form of eminent domain legislation or in the form of mandates that one has to purchase a particular product, for instance. Those are a form of special favors.
I would much rather see, for example, government-funded and run healthcare clinics where anybody can go in and receive treatment, to a system where insurance companies have a captive clientele which is forced to purchase a product from a private company month after month after month.
I agree with that.
I think that it would be much better if there were simple free clinics for standard care that people could use that were government-run. And, I mean, as a libertarian, I still think that would be suboptimal compared to small private clinics without the medical insurance industry, health insurance industry. But it would still be better than...
I think we should have that industry just be privatized. It should just be privatized, right? Like,
well, you can't privatize it until you kill the health insurance.
Well, I think there's room for both, really. You know, the idea of these, you know, where government-run health clinics are provided for people who just cannot afford private-run clinics. But, you know, with the private-run clinics, these are also going to be proliferated with the advancements of technologies, because we are moving towards a system where it's going to be self-care, because people are starting to use their phones to make medical decisions, which are going to their doctors and their nurses. And so that's going to be an integration and maybe even a bridge between the private health clinics and the government single-payer health clinics as well. That would act as a sort of bridge with using advanced technology.
I like what you're saying. Well, BJ, I like what you're saying, but I would say that it's not as... I wouldn't think of it as quite as much of a bridge as it's like a bridge to the sentiment of, like, the good intentions of what government healthcare is, right? I believe in, you know, like, good intentions aren't good enough, but I have no doubt that, you know, when we have, you know, like when we try universal healthcare and we want to provide government healthcare, that it's really good intentions is what those are all about. We want people to have access to good healthcare. We want people to be healthy, and I believe it's a bridge to that sentiment, right? Without the unintended consequences, though. It's having a private, like, it's private industry is what we're saying, but just basically it's like people not slowed down by government bureaucracy to, like, be like, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. How do I solve this problem as efficiently and cheaply and as fast as possible so I can give it to as many people as possible so I can make more money, right? And then, like, economy of scale would drive down the price. Like, cell phones started out expensive, and now I see homeless people with cell phones. You know what I mean? It's like, so you want the free market to be able to thrive so you can develop this stuff as fast as possible. Like, we're all transhumanists, and we want to be able to enjoy a lot of these therapies, and they're not going to happen that fast if they're not in the system that grows the fastest.
And the system is so ingrown and broken right now. I mean, if I find a mole on my arm and I want to find out if this mole is cancerous, I have to call a dermatologist who is part of my healthcare plan, somebody who is not going to charge me outside of my insurance. And then I have to make an appointment with them, which is probably going to be a month away at least. Maybe 2 weeks if I'm super lucky and they have an opening.
You live in Canada? Where do you live?
We live in Nevada.
Yes, United States. Yes, to get a basic visit, even a preventive visit,
just with a regular dermatologist,
must schedule at least weeks in advance, if not months. And while if the condition is mild or durable, or if it's just a desire for a consultation that is manageable, but if it's something life-threatening, I suspect there are a lot of people who, having the ability to pay, having the means to afford care, are still denied care because of this implicit rationing through waiting time.
And we want to drive the prices down, right? That's, I feel like, a big goal, is like we want to make sure it's like, I feel like when people talk about healthcare, they're thinking it's so expensive and we need to subsidize people so they can afford this expensive product. And I believe that the product is artificially expensive.
Yes, it
is. I feel like we need to take steps to drive the price down.
We need things that are required to survive, like healthcare and whatnot. They should not be for-profit based. That's why they're so artificially,
Well, food is required to survive.
Yes, and if food, it's interesting because if food were allocated the same way that healthcare is allocated today, with an extremely complex system with very specific rules and procedures and protocols for every possible contingency.
Prices, by the way. There are no price tags on anything in the supermarket until you take it up to the checkout.
It would be a horrible system in terms of getting people access to food. I think the profit motive is very helpful in getting people who otherwise might not particularly be interested in the well-being of strangers to supply services that those strangers would nonetheless benefit from. The long waiting lines, the high costs of care are not the result of a for-profit system. They're a result of a system where everything has become very rigid and everything has predefined pathways through which it must go. And in the minds of hundreds of central planners over the course of the previous decades, there was some logic behind each component of that system.
He's a bureaucrat,
but
so he's speaking
Are you a bureaucrat? You're a bureaucrat?
I'm a benevolent bureaucrat who wants things to work better.
Technocrat.
But I think it's important to understand. Many bureaucrats, many central planners are very well-intentioned people. They want to achieve good outcomes. Even from a pure humanitarian standpoint, they may have a lot of salutary motivations, but the system that we have right now is the result of a lot of central plans that have been made throughout the decades, as well as a lot of, let's say, reactions to those central plans, say lobbying efforts by various entrenched industries, or just unpredicted consequences of human behavior, generating some perverse incentives. And what has happened is a hyper-complex network that no single person can understand fully, no single person can affect. Even the best-intentioned bureaucrat cannot pull all the levers of the system. And as a result, you have classification. Yes, medical codes. The ICD codes, where there are codes for a lot of odd types of injuries. And there's a rationale for each particular code, but no matter how complex the coding system can get, it cannot anticipate every contingency. It cannot anticipate every new...
that code.
I forget the specific code, but I have a point.
Okay, sorry.
I have a point.
There's a code for being bitten by a cow.
The system is...
I thought it was funny.
Very complex in an unintended manner, and at the same time very rigid, because each component of the system was fixed in place by somebody at some point in time. And others may see the problems. A lot of politicians, bureaucrats, they recognize that it's not a perfect system. But if the reaction is create another plan to change it, create another protocol or procedure to revise it, well, maybe it'll have some beneficial effects, but it may also add to the complexity that we're dealing with. So to get away from that complexity, there needs to be more power put back into individuals to make their own decisions, as long as they're not imposing harm on other people. That's where libertarianism, I think, is very important. And with individuals making their own decisions, technological progress can occur more rapidly because they don't have to ask permission. If a person wants to, say, do DIY biology his garage and
CRISPR.
do body modification experiments.
Yeah, why not?
That person might fail. That person might have adverse side effects.
They might die.
But I think as long as that person isn't rounding up people and performing coercive experiments on those people, that kind of self-experimentation should be allowed.
I agree with that, but I would think that
that will be important. That will be important when it comes to. What was that, Jules?
Morphological
go ahead.
freedom.
Yeah, morphological freedom. I agree with that, and
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. No, I was going to say what Gennady was saying is to allow these things to flourish without it becoming the act of a more. We have to ensure that everyone has the right to morphological freedom, but we also want to make sure that that morphological freedom isn't being exploited by people like ISIS, because I'm sure they would definitely use the genetics revolution to their own advantage eventually, just like they're using the internet to their advantage.
Yeah, I think it's going to come down. I think it's going to come down to transhumanists versus like ISIS or some kind of relative of basically this is my own prediction of how are we going to become a global civilization? I believe we're going to have certain ideological wars, whether they're soft wars, with the written word, or some kind of regretful combination. But ultimately, I do think it's important that we all come together, and that when it comes to morphological freedom, you don't want some cult leader or some kind of evil organization, manipulating people to doing these very dangerous modifications because they're just trying to make studies go faster. But I think the best guard against that is the internet and positive messages, with a signal cutting through the noise. I believe it's up to people to look out for each other. I think it's up for people to look out for each other. Do you know what I mean? And to educate people so that people aren't susceptible to being misled by someone nefarious, doing their private studies. I imagine in a libertarian situation, you would have these stories of the person that found a bunch of vulnerable people and did body mods on them, and it was technically consent, but it's not really a favorable situation. I think it would be up to people. I think it would be very important up to people to point that out, report on it, and then deal with that accordingly, right? As in that's the problem with regulations, is you want to regulate against something like that from happening, but that's not even what prevents it. Do you know what I mean? Passing a law doesn't prevent the behavior. It just kind of it creates a black market for it, and it's ultimately I believe it's up to people to look out for each other and to codify each other's behavior. And you're going to have these bad examples, but
so
there's not much you can do about it.
Let's try to establish some more common ground. Would it be fair to say we all agree that personalized medicine should be allowed to develop as rapidly as possible, whether or not there is some regulation that would be justified for that is a matter of extensive further discussion, but personalized medicine, trying to get away from essentially a centralized, rigid model of delivering healthcare and more toward an individualized model where people have access to their own data, to their own metrics, to ways to measure vital statistics about their health, would be a good thing. And furthermore, accelerating medical research would be a good thing by removing ossified institutional barriers from the ability of such research to advance.
Yeah, I agree.
Most definitely.
BJ?
Yeah, I would agree that personalized medicine should be proliferated as opposed to the centralized rigidity of the current healthcare system. I think we could learn a lot from how abortions are operating. These are things where it's the private individual's choice, but there is also medical oversight provided in its legality, and that provides certain government regulations, but it provides the open involvement of that individual in their decision making that is in control of their own bodies, so long it doesn't harm other people. So there's that nice integration of both regulation and the individual expression.
Well, BJ, I like what you're saying, but would it be possible to consider an alternative? Like, instead of having a government FDA, if you had some private institution that did its own PR marketing and became popular and a trusted source
Actually,
for
something like that
checking
exists
out
for electronics.
Right.
It's
Yes.
the little UL that you see on electronic devices is actually a private institution.
So imagine if a private institution develops a reputation and becomes trusted, or a number of them. So, like, you might be doing you might have a biohacking company, but if you don't have the badge from this trusted, checker, right? Like, people might not use it, right? So instead of having the government providing oversight, you have private institutions taking that role of providing oversight.
Private certification.
And then the people that want to do the sketchier shit for whatever reason, like, they can do that with the knowledge that it's not as accredited as certain biohacking facilities that would have these private companies that people trust, and I believe they would donate to them, just kind of like people donate to Wikipedia, and people donate to people donate to Kickstarter and to Indiegogo, and people will provide the financial reasons to these regulators, but I think it's important that it's not government doing the regulating, that it's private individuals that are kind of regulating each other, that it's the market regulating itself.
I think today it's necessarily going to be a hybrid system, and today it's already a hybrid system. There is a plethora of private certifications, for instance, professional certifications offered by private associations. There's even a move toward open source credentialing and certifications. I would encourage everyone to look up Open Badges, which is an initiative by Mozilla, which also offers the open source Firefox browser. But the idea is it's a digital certification that anybody would be able to recognize, anybody would be able to view with the proper open source access protocol, and it would be essentially a badge that you can display on your digital profile, on a website, on a mobile device, wherever someone might look, and it would replace the kind of more arcane ways people have today of demonstrating their qualifications. But I think one other important point to make is one of practicality. That is to say, you can have emergent systems regulate particular processes. You're not always going to have that ability, or it might take time for that ability to develop. And in the meantime, there is a concept of individual rights, and there is a concept of basic justice. And for instance, in the Lockean model, government is formed to protect individual rights, to protect individuals against aggression or against fraud, where a private network has not yet emerged. So one possible point of consensus that I would offer is today, in the status quo, government in some form is necessary and is going to continue to be necessary for some time while technology progresses, while private alternatives emerge, because ultimately people, especially less philosophically inclined people, are going to think in terms of how do we solve the problems that we have right now. And if you can't point to a private institution and say, oh, this institution has you covered, like Walmart has you covered for a lot of basic goods, or Underwriters Laboratories has you covered for certifications on electrical devices.
Yeah, you knew what I was talking about with the UL.
Or say, you can have private associations offer certificates in computer programming, or a lot of insurance-related credentials that I'm very familiar with. So a private model can definitely work, but for most people, you're going to have to point to a solution and say, okay, if not government, then it's this alternative. But in the meantime, you need some form of justice. You need some form of making sure people are protected against initiation of force and against fraud. And I don't know how long it's going to take for that to wither away in the way, say, a lot of socialists
deal with it
might
in
have wanted.
attrition. You need to deal with it in attrition. Like, you need to scale back the government from what it is. Like, and you need to like set a timetable for like which institutions you're going to cut out. You can start with the universal basic income, but you know people are going to have a lot of trouble like stomaching the removal of certain institutions overnight. Even though I think that's the best idea, but I think you would then prepare that transition through attrition by basically announcing we are going to take these things away at these times. So entrepreneurs, like, you got 4 years or 5 years or 2 years or whatever it is to plan your response to the opening of the market, because there's going to be all these new opportunities for when we take away these institutions. You just need to provide the time table for the private market to then sort of calculate how they're going to respond.
The challenge that I see with just announcing a time frame is a similar challenge to, say, a doctor performing surgery on a patient. Let's say a patient has a disease, tumor, for instance, and everyone agrees the tumor is bad. The tumor has caused some serious problems, but you also don't want to get rid of too much healthy tissue in the organism. You don't want to damage any systems that are actually working, however imperfectly. So it's very essential, say, for a doctor operating on a patient to perform the surgery in the exact right procedure, take the exact right sequence of steps. And the same, I would say, applies to reforming a government. One can't just start cutting programs willy-nilly and see what happens, because it may be, as Sheldon Richman, a great libertarian, pointed out, certain government programs are actually responses to the unintended consequences posed by other government programs. Say welfare. We're talking about welfare serving as a social safety net. And a lot of the economic distortions that lead people today to be extremely destitute are the result of crony capitalism, special subsidies, economic favors, barriers to entry being promulgated that prevent people from competing in the market, from essentially realizing their full potential and becoming productive and self-sufficient. So the current welfare system prevents, in a sense, a lot of these people from rioting in the streets by giving them something. And it would be better to improve that by making it unconditional. But I would say if tomorrow somebody proposed to abolish all welfare while retaining corporate subsidies, I would say that's probably a bad idea. However, if somebody tomorrow proposed to abolish all corporate subsidies while retaining the welfare system, I would say that's better. That's a lot better. That's a more logical sequence of steps.
Right. Yeah, I like the cancer analogy. I would also compare it to alcoholism, maybe, in terms of, like, there's severe alcoholics that if they just stop drinking, they'll die. You know what I mean? And they actually have to be weaned off, and until they can, survive without drinking alcohol, right? Because their body has been so, the toxicity is just, like, so a part of their life, that they actually can't, their body has adapted to not be able to survive without it. And I think that in the same way, like, I would be worried of the shock, of how severe the shock could be, which I don't know, if you were just dramatic, and it could be a psychological shock too, right? Like, people are emotional, and if you were just to, like, completely pull the rug out from a lot of people simultaneously, you have, automated jobs and, like, higher unemployment. I think it actually would be the fastest way to get to the best solution, but I don't know how disruptive that would be, which is the reason why I would announce a time frame for certain things while others just, like, cut out the tissue, like, where you can cleanly. So I think I don't disagree with you on anything. I was just sort of focusing on semantics and, like, why I think, just, like, tomorrow or something, just like getting rid of all these institutions that exist and just having a universal basic income might be problematic, but I'm not sure. Because actually, then again, I kind of agree with you. I'm just a middleman here thinking about other people, what other people's hesitations might be as well, because there are some things I'm uncertain about.
Fair enough. Now, let me offer one thought on this, and then I think it would be good to go to closing comments from everyone as to all of the ideas that we've discussed. My thought is, as I said, there needs to be some sort of transition, and the real challenge is envisioning how that transition would take place, what the right sequence of steps would be, and how to enable decentralized mechanisms and institutions and people's choices to bring about that transition, because we can't centrally plan it either. And now, one possibility is essentially laboratories of experimentation, where you might have the existing system operate largely as it is in many places, but you allow people the freedom to form their own communities. For instance, through the seasteading movement, or through chartered cities, or other types of jurisdictions where you have the freedom for people to form alternative political arrangements. Say a group of people decides to get on a modular floating platform and say, okay, we're going to experiment with a fully laissez-faire society. Absolutely no economic regulation whatsoever. Another group of people might say, we're going to form a socialist commune. However we define what a socialist commune would be. And we're going to go to a seastead and do that. And as long as they're all in agreement to do that, they might discover some insights about what works, what doesn't. Or you could have, say, a charter city, as has been proposed in various jurisdictions, which is an economically freer zone that's not subject to many of the laws of the host country, but there may still be some basic police protections, for instance, some basic infrastructure that is provided, and see how that type of economic arrangement works out. So I would say system-wide reform is a matter for very thorough deliberation, but experimentation with particular arrangements in a more localized fashion, I think, could be very helpful in getting us the correct solutions and the correct sequence of steps faster. So with that, I think I'd like to open it up to closing statements from everyone. BJ, what would you like to say?
Well, I mean, I've come to the point where we all have a certain pride in our ideologies, but with that there are also similarities that we've come to an agreement on. And for me, it all started being a socialist first, and then getting into transhumanism. That had opened me up to the ideas of capitalism and its importance as it is as a system today. And it started with when I was watching a conference meeting that Peter Diamandis was having, and he was talking about automation and the impact it's going to have on the workforce. And someone in the audience had asked, well, what exactly are we going to be, where are we heading as a result of this automation, and what's going to happen with capitalism? And I knew that Peter Diamandis was like a former boss to me when I was with the Planetary Resources. I knew him as a libertarian capitalist, so I was interested in what his ideas were. And he talked about automation and everything, but at the end of it all, he said something that I found was quite profound, and I quote, he said, "I am a libertarian capitalist at heart, but we are moving towards a future of socialism." And so I thought, well, if someone like Peter Diamandis can make an assertion like that, then there's got to be a lot more common ground between our ideologies than there is a conflict. There's got to be some kind of cohesive tape between what I believe as a Marxist and what others believe as libertarian capitalists. There must be something that brings us together, and I think transhumanism helps bring about a more cohesive ideologies, because we have a goal for a future that we all agree on, and I think that will help sort of bring a bridge between our ideologies instead of a violent revolution or anything as destructive and detrimental as that would be to our society.
I thought that was very nice.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you completely. BJ, in terms of transhumanism being that bridge to a more peaceful society that actualizes all of our ideals. And I think we're all here in opposition to violent revolution, which destroys lives and destroys infrastructure that we need for our progress. So, Brandon, would you like to make a closing statement?
Oh, hold on a second. I actually have to think about this for a second.
All right.
I can.
That's something in mind, but I lost my train of thought.
Sure. Okay, Wendy, you go ahead.
All right. Well, I was actually surprised how much common ground we were able to find with regard to things like universal basic income, reforming the healthcare system. I think ultimately it is because we share the same goal, which is to live on our own terms as long as we like. And I think that is essentially a very liberal idea in the sense of free. And ultimately, if we can reach that goal together, it will be a more peaceful society. I think hyperpluralism of ideas is vital for getting there. And I think that as we approximate post-scarcity society and multi-planetary society, we will have more experimental labs in which to try out these sorts of ideas. So I think the conversation leaves me very optimistic about the future. And
Very nice.
Thank you.
Okay. Brandon, are you ready for your closing statement?
Yes. I'd just like to say that with these emerging technologies, we can really, start to downsize and allow for greater efficiency of the government while working for greater self-sufficiency and sustainability for our common man.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very good.
All right, Jules, you get the last word.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Well, I wanted to sort of echo something that BJ said, and I try to be skeptical of myself and of the world. I try to be skeptical of the world and of myself, and I try not to have, too much pride with any of my ideas, but of course I have a pride with them because, I try to be rigorous and I try to expose myself to as much criticism as possible. And I found that, many theories or ideas I once had, like, kind of change or evolve, but it doesn't mean I threw them all away. It just means that, like, they've become something else. And Karl Popper, who's one of my favorite philosophers, talks about this, how, the fact that we all stand on the shoulders of giants and how, the theories that we provisionally adopt are the ones that withstand the most rigorous criticism, right? And that just because, Einstein's theory of relativity might not be perfect when you start looking at quantum physics. Quantum physics might reveal, shortcomings in relativity. That doesn't mean that you throw relativity out completely, or that relativity is a failure. It just means that there are new things to consider now with the new information. And I think especially in a world where you have an indefinite lifespan and we're going to be constantly solving problems and looking for new problems to solve, you have to keep an open mind. You can't be too attached to any one thing other than, striving for truth and human flourish.
Well, thank you for those comments, Jules, and I appreciate the insights of everybody today. I think we have a lot of common ground and we have a lot of directions that we could take this conversation or similar conversations further. Unfortunately, we only have so much time this evening, so I would suggest we adjourn for now and perhaps reconvene at some future time to discuss some threads that we have started on today.
BJ, thank you so much for organizing this.
Yes, thank
man.
you, BJ.
Thank you so much for bringing us all together and making this happen, dude. That's awesome.
Oh yeah,
I'm very thankful for Gennady. Yeah.
You made it work. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night,
great meeting
everyone.
for the first time.
Peace.
Good meeting you as well.
It was wonderful meeting everyone.
Night.
Good night.